Hello, Natascha. How are you? We are here on Shift Tactic 12. Tell us what we're talking about.
Hey, we are talking about bulletproofing the transaction.
I love it. So this is our 12th video. You've been wearing subliminal messages on your t-shirts all along, and you're just now telling me what your t-shirts say.
Find a way or make one, which we're going to talk about.
I love it. Okay, so bulletproofing the transaction. There's a quote at the start of this chapter by Abraham Lincoln that says, if I had 8 hours to chop down a tree, I would spend 6 hours sharpening my axe. And I think, wow, what a thought there, because, you know, we're wrapping up this shift series, but all along we've been talking about this skill set, right? And best practices in developing skills to be successful in a shifting market. How do you think about it?
So I think about, this kind of bulletproofing your transaction is what do we need to do? What skills do we need to learn? How do we become solution based? Because that's truly what bulletproofing the transaction is now that we've got a successful buyer and seller who are ready, willing, and able to go forward, how do we keep that deal together? And so in the market we just came through, well, things just moved so quickly. And if you didn't sell it to that person, you had probably 5 or 10 more right behind it. That may not be the case as we move forward. So we need to become very solution based as the professionals in getting the transaction and keeping it together, moving forward.
So the market we're coming out of was a little bit of a hashtag as is market, right? Like they didn't have to be solution based. You just took it or leave it, right? And
it was a take it or leave it.
Yeah, and now it's like, we actually have to get involved to help kind of play chess to get the deal to close, right?
Yeah, to facilitate.
I love it. All right. There are 6 issues in bulletproofing a transaction they talk about on figure 61, and the 6 issues, and we're going to dive into these. First is inspections and repairs. Number 2 is appraisals. 3 is loan approval and funding. 4 is other contingencies. 5 is the co-op agents. And then 6 is deadlines. So let's dive in. Talk to me about inspections and repairs.
All right, so first thing we have is, the things that could go wrong. So, the buyer could have unexpected findings on that inspection report. So visibly it looks fine, but as that inspector gets in there, their job is to uncover things. Well, our solution is a seller could get a pre-inspection on that property. That would avoid us putting a property on the market then where the deal dies ultimately because a buyer finds something wrong in the inspection. So have that home pre-inspected, and now we know, feeling confident moving forward, there's not going to be anything that's uncovered that hasn't already been repaired. So that would be the first thing. Next thing is like report complexity. So that report could be overwhelming, could be concerning to a buyer. Ensuring that the buyer's agent is accompanying on that inspection and that the seller is aware of things that show up on there. Things that show up, the cost and who pays for it. Well, like Brett, like you just said, we just came through a market where it was the as is, where is. Well, as things shift, we'll start to see some more repair clauses in our contracts. Part of ensuring that we have that in there is to help facilitate the deal to stay together. And so having some pre-negotiated limits would be a solution. Not that it's unending, but just a limit, a cap on what a seller may be willing to do to keep that transaction together. Also a timetable for repairs, ensuring that any repairs that are going to be done are done, in the timetable that they need to be done in. And then I think the last thing that would go wrong would be the doubt about the worthiness. And so being, skill-based, ensuring that we're having those conversations and prepared to reassure a buyer when doubt is created, that we are skill-based enough to have the conversation and help them overcome that, because buyer remorse shows up, and it shows up often during the inspection report.
There you go. Well, the second thing around bulletproofing a transaction is appraisals. And we're coming out of a market, Natascha, where we waived appraisals. We didn't even discuss appraisals per se, or we even just kind of said, okay, the lender needs it, but it really wasn't a part of the transaction over the last 12 to 18 months in most transactions. However, it's a normal part of a transaction in most normal markets. And as we shift out of that market and make our way back to a normal market or a shifting market, appraisals are going to be a big part of bulletproofing the transaction. Here's the thing, it's got to support the price. That's what it says in the contract. Well, remember, we've been aggressively pricing houses for a while now, and it's going to catch up to us at some point, and you're going to have appraisals that are going to come in a little bit low. And how do you bulletproof around that, right? How do you move to mastery around that? The appraisal's got to support the loan, meaning occupancy rates in condo markets and all kinds of insurabilities and things like that have to play a factor with appraisals. If it's a government backed loan, condition is a part of an appraisal, right? So it's got to support the loan. And then obviously if it doesn't match the CMA, what that means is, as real estate professionals, there's actually a skill around talking to appraisers and providing comps, and I wouldn't say manipulating, but certainly being communicative with the appraiser to help the appraiser find the way to make value meet inside of your transaction. And that's why appraisals is such a big part of bulletproofing the transaction. What do you have next, Natascha?
Next would be our loan approval and funding. So here's where some things are, and kind of I'm going to start with one thing that's not in this book, and that's our interest rates. And since we're in this increasing interest rate environment, it's critical more than ever that when that buyer applies for that loan and they're qualified at whatever the interest rate is quoted at the time, the buyer seriously consider a rate lock. Because what we've seen happen, if the future is any indicative of what just happened in the recent past, where interest rates crept up so quickly, we don't want to have a buyer fall into a situation where they're pre-qualified at their max, we find them the property, and now the interest rate has moved on to a different price point, and now that it's no longer affordable for that buyer. So rate locks, I would say, would be one of the first things you want to consider when you're thinking about the loan approval and funding. And then if we look at this list here, the next thing would be application delays, right? So how do we overcome that? Well, making sure that we're in business with a lender that is reputable, that is communicative, that is quick to respond, and that has their ducks in a row so that our loan moves forward through the approval process. Again, the next things would be like documenting any problems that occur. And we can, I don't necessarily personally recommend assisting a buyer with paperwork. I would say ensure that the lender has the people to assist a buyer with paperwork, and that the buyer knows, buyer credit issues. So if we're looking at working with a buyer, ensuring, and again, we're all professionals, so we know you're always getting that buyer pre-approved. But in a shifting market, it's more critical than before. The buyer has some credit dings on there. Working with a credit repair specialist, a reputable credit repair specialist that can help that buyer get qualified and get into the home buying market. Next thing would be the lender fails to approve. Well, in that case, they can reapply with the corrections. So if there's something that showed up that maybe was applied incorrectly, they applied wrong, maybe taxes hadn't been filed or something that happened, help making sure that you have a lender that can help the buyer through that process so that they can reapply for a loan. What happens, again, same thing, if a lender fails to fund the loan, same parallel solution as to the prior one. And then buyer credit changes. This is our favorite, buyer credit changes. I would say just like the interest rates in the beginning, buyer credit changes are critically important. Ensuring that you're doing a buyer consult on the very front end of meeting with a buyer. You're letting them know all of the things that they shouldn't do because you don't want any changes to their credit.
There you go. Other contingencies, number 4. And other contingencies could be a sale of another property. We haven't had contingency contracts on contingent of a sale of another property in a long time, right? But at some point in time, it'll make its way back up. And as a professional, you're involved in this transaction, but when you domino it to a previous transaction, you have to be proactive in following up with the progress and how that transaction's going as well. So it's certainly something you proactively need to go at to bulletproof the transaction. Third-party approvals. communication is always key. And as Natascha was talking about in the loan approval and funding, third-party approvals is just simply getting the approvals done, right? And communicating with the people that are the decision makers and actually granting the approvals, right? And staying in great communication. Estate relocations, short sale approvals. Remember, we were talking in Tactic 11 about the mastering the market of the moment. This is a skill set. This is something you don't just take lightly. You got to learn the ins and outs of what a short sale is. What do I need to ask about? Do I need to check in on this? Who do I need to talk to? Who's the decision maker? All those things is a part of your fiduciary duty to bulletproof this transaction, and learning how to do that at a high level. And then, of course, a clouded title. Whether you close with a closing attorney or a title escrow attorney, depending on your state, the bottom line is you want to know about a clouded title as early as possible in a transaction. And working with reputable people that provide timely service around title insurance gives you an opportunity to clear a clouded title. And learning it even just how to read title documents and understand if a title is even clouded is an important part of bulletproofing the transaction.
Awesome. All right, let's go to number 5, which is our co-op agent. And so the first thing under what could go wrong would be bad advice or communication. So again, this comes down to communication. Clarify your messages. Make sure that whatever we're telling them verbally, we're documenting via an email. Texts are great for quick communication. My challenge with text is the communication's not always clear. Siri can misunderstand what we're saying, or we could be writing in all caps when we don't mean to, and the other person takes it as if we're yelling at them. So I always say use the phone first, then follow up with a written documentation of that conversation. Next thing is inattention to details. So when a market is shifting, you might find that some members of our real estate community now have other sources of income, and maybe real estate is no longer the full-time opportunity. One of the things we want to make sure is that sometimes we have to do the job of 2 people. That's just part of what happens in a shifting market, is that we want to ensure that the party that we represent, we just want to ensure that this transaction gets closed. And so when others have inattention to detail or not being communicative, we're over communicating, and sometimes we just pick up the ball and have to run with it. And the last thing is poor vendor selection by the other party. So if we're the listing agent, have a vendor selection list, a pre-approved list. No one's obligated to use it, but it could be a backup source, especially if somebody's working in a market that's not their normal market. They might not have the vendors to select from locally.
Perfect. Well, last and certainly not least is deadlines. And we used to operate from what I called a critical date letter. And you realize when you sign a contract, there's timing and dates attached to a lot of different things inside of a contract, whether it's financing or appraisals or repairs or due diligence or inspections and all that stuff. But knowing when those deadlines are is critical, i.e. the critical date letter. But more importantly, the concept of bulletproofing a transaction is being proactive around those deadlines, not just knowing when they are, but are getting things handled in front of the deadlines. Being communicative and proactive in front of those deadlines is critical in bulletproofing a transaction. Whether it's closing date, occupancy, or any of that stuff, critical dates is everything.
Yeah, and you know what I would add to that, Brett? You talked about a proactive step. Here's where the use of a transaction coordinator would be very, very beneficial to our agents. So if you're not currently utilizing the services of a transaction coordinator, they are an invaluable partner in our business that could help us keep our transactions together.
100%. It's not an expense, it's an investment in bulletproofing a transaction, right?
100%.
There you go. So at the end of the day, not that we were reactive in a great, healthy, thriving real estate market, but the encouragement, I'm just going to lead the point here, is to be proactive. And by the way, it's not a shifting market strategy. It's a business strategy to be proactive and ahead of things, anticipating things, and certainly communicating around things is a proactive strategy to success. Natascha, I want to throw one thing in real quick. On page 252 in the Shift book, there are the 7 don'ts of mortgage funding. And I'm just going to read these real quick and then tell me your opinions. Number 1 is don't change your employment status. Number 2, don't make any major purchases, whether car, furniture, home theater, vacations, etc., etc. Number 3, don't increase your credit card debt or miss any payments. Number 4, don't change bank accounts or make undisclosed large deposits. 5, don't apply for a credit card, co-sign a loan, or make a credit inquiry. Number 6, don't spend money you have set aside for closing, not any, not ever. And number 7, don't delay in providing all paperwork asked for by the mortgage company. What this list, it seems like a no-brainer, yet we're talking about bulletproofing a transaction and best practices. How do you see this being a best practice for real estate professionals?
Yeah, so what I would say what separates the professionals from the non is, especially if we're representing the buyer, is to have a true buyer consultation. If we're working and consulting a buyer on the front end, this would be one of the topics we would discuss in that consultation of all the things they shouldn't do during the home buying process. And then if that's the case, we should be reminding them once we've found their perfect home and we've got them secured under contract, we should be reminding them of this list. Because inevitably a buyer is going to go out as they're visualizing themselves living in this new home and they're furniture shopping. Now, what they intended to do was furniture shop virtually, meaning they were just window shopping. They were just kind of placing it in their mind what they wanted. But they walk into that store and there's all the no interest payments for 12 months or 24 months or 36 months. And they think, no big deal. I can just buy the furniture today because I don't have to pay for it now. Well, Brett, we all know what happens. That just showed up on their credit as an inquiry and as additional debt. And can't tell you, between furniture and cars, it's happened where even though you've had the conversation, it still takes place. So having the conversation on the front end and reminding them once again when we're under contract.
Right. Absolutely. Well, let's jump into our 3 questions. Our 3 questions are, question number 1, what part of your transaction to close needs a better system or checklist?
Number 2, what conversation should you be having with clients to facilitate a bulletproof transaction?
And number 3, how do you hold a standard in your business of being proactive? There you go. Tactic number 12.
The final in our Shift series. Brett, it's been awesome.
Awesome. Thanks for listening. Hope you learned something, but more importantly, best practices and move to mastery around all these tactics we just shared with you. Natascha,
Absolutely.
I appreciate you.
I appreciate you too. And everyone, if you haven't yet jumped on to those morning pivot shift calls, now is your opportunity. You've gone through the series, grab the book and get connected. See you all soon.